Welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takeishi, a board-certified music therapist. Join me each week as a new guest from across the fine and creative arts spheres shares struggles, triumphs, laughs, words of wisdom, and more in authentic, thought-provoking, and inspiring interviews. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm so excited to be joined again by my friend Paulette Kennedy. She crafts character-driven, upmarket historical fiction with feminist themes and a speculative bent. And in her novels, you'll find positive LGBTQ+ representation, women living on the fringes of society, page-turning plots, and supernatural metaphors for the challenges, joys, triumphs, and societal concerns women faced in the past as well as today, all filtered through a gothic lens. And I have read nearly all of her books. She's got Parting of the Veil, The Witch of Tin Mountain, The Devil and Miss Davenport, and the upcoming, depending on when you listen to this episode, upcoming or currently out, The Artist of Blackberry Grange. I've currently started that last one. I can't wait to finish. Paulette, your books are just fabulous. Just fabulous. Gothic fiction is something that I realized I loved when I was in college, and it's just so nice to find such a fresh, just eloquent take on it in the way that you write it. So welcome back to the show. For those not familiar with your work, I would love for you to just dig in a little bit to how you got your start as a writer.
Hi, Tammy. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for your wonderful compliments on my work. I really appreciate you. And so I started out writing as a child, as a lot of us who are writers did. I fell in love with reading at a young age. And from there, I just developed a need to tell stories of my own. And I fell in love with Gothic fiction whenever I was a teenager, when my mom introduced me to the work of the Brontes. And I started reading other more contemporary Gothic fiction like V.C. Andrews and like all of the things that were really big in the 80s and 90s, all of those kind of Gothic authors. And I started dabbling in writing novels whenever I was in college, but I didn't really ever finish anything until I was in my 40s. I had lots of incomplete manuscripts, and it took a lot of drive and determination for me to finish my first manuscript. And that is the manuscript that ended up turning into Parting the Veil. And basically, it was just me getting over myself and getting over the hump of not feeling like I could complete a manuscript, because I'd been working at being a writer for a long time, but I didn't really have a lot of time to dedicate to the craft like I wanted to. I was a single mom for a period of time in my 30s. I was running a business. There were lots of different things that I was doing and also writing. And then whenever the pandemic hit, I lost all my work as a wedding photographer. And that enabled me to have a little bit more time to dedicate to my writing. And so that's whenever I was able to really buckle down and finish the manuscript that became Parting the Veil.
Excellent. And now, as we were talking before recording, your fourth book, The Artist of Blackberry Grange, which I think, given some of my work in what I do in my field, is probably one of my favorites so far, just subject matter wise. And then you've got a fifth one coming down the pike. So, you are, you're a fountain of creativity right now, which is great. It's like once you got or it seems like anyway, and correct me if I'm wrong, but once you got your break into the business, it seems like nothing can stop you now. And I think that's fabulous.
Well, thank you. I think publishing is one of those things. It's a long game. It's a marathon. A lot of people say it's a marathon, not a sprint. And that's very true. I did get very lucky in that I was able to find an agent with the first novel that I completed. A lot of authors, they have to write several manuscripts before that happens. And I did get lucky, that is a part of the equation for sure. Hard work is a factor. And I do have dry spells. It's one of those things where you don't see everything on the internet. I do try to write honestly about my experiences being an author, because I think that on the outside, it can look very shiny and glamorous. And like we are just this fount of creative output. And I do have dry spells. I had a pretty significant dry spell in 2022 and I could not write for months. And I was on deadline for The Devil and Mrs. Davenport at that time. And I started writing that novel. I had written my proposal, which is basically the first 3 chapters in the synopsis, which is what you have to have in order to sell a novel to your existing publisher. At least with my publisher, you had to have at least that. So I had that done, but I couldn't write after that. And then 2 months before my deadline, it was just like the fountains opened and the novel came out. And I basically wrote the entire book within a 2-month period, which is not ideal. It's very stressful to do that. It's not my preference, but it was just where I was mentally and emotionally. I just could not write. But the 4th novel that is coming out in May, The Artist of Blackberry Grange, I took a nice long time writing that one. I think it took me about 6 months to draft it. And it was very complex and it made my head hurt. I often joke that it's a gigantic math problem in the guise of a novel because of the time slips. It was my first experience writing a novel that had elements of time travel or time slips. And it's quite an enterprise to write a novel like that, I must say.
Yeah. You are so brave doing that. Like my brain would not be able to brain like that. I'd be like, no, it's too much math.
Yeah, it was a lot of math, a lot of figuring out like birth dates, death dates, and things like that. And my copy editors are wonderful at pointing out continuity errors, and I'm very grateful for that. Luckily, I did not have a lot of continuity errors with this one, and that was because I made notes the whole time I was drafting about where I was in the story and what date it was to keep myself on track, and it helped immensely.
I think I asked this last time, and I love asking this of authors who have multiple books. What is something that you learned from your previous books that you brought into the writing of the newer books?
I think having a plan and having something of a synopsis. I don't always write a fully fleshed out synopsis before I begin writing because I do like to leave room for some discovery. But I always have what I call a tentpole outline where I know how the story is going to end. I know what the midpoint is going to be, and I know what the inciting incident, the thing that kicks off the main character's journey. I know what those things are going to do before I ever start drafting. So that is something that I feel like I've carried over. I had with my first novel, I pantsed the entire novel. I discovery wrote the entire novel, and I ended up having to rewrite it 3 times. So I figured out that was not my best process. And a lot of it is just figuring out what your best process is as an author, because it's a little different for everyone. I think too, another thing that I carry through with all my work is I do my research in stages. So I'll do like overarching, wide level, like global type research before I start writing, but I'll hone in on all of those historical details, especially with world building. A little bit later, like I'm working on my 5th novel right now, and I just returned from Charleston, and being there in that environment helped with all of the sensory details that I need in order to tell the story correctly. I knew a lot of the history before going there, but being in the place where the history happened, there's just something ineffable about that comes through in the work. And so I think it's a very important component and something I will definitely carry forward with every book. With my first book, it was written during the COVID-19 pandemic. I was not able to travel to Hampshire during that time to do my research. And I really wish I would have been able to, because I think it would have really made the work a little bit more richer.
With the book coming out in 2025, The Artist of Blackberry Grange, what is, without giving away spoilers, of course, what is one of the scenes that you found or things that you found to be most difficult to write? And what is one of the scenes or things that you found to be most joyful to write?
The things that were the most difficult to write, I feel like, were just having everything flow together and make sense between the timelines. Multiple timeline fiction is really difficult and it can be challenging. Some people are really good at it and they excel at it with their first attempt. And it was very challenging for me. And it wasn't that it wasn't joyful to write those things. It was, I enjoyed the challenge of it. I enjoy a good challenge. But one of the things that I enjoyed writing the most was Marguerite's story. I really love her as a character. And I thought about making her a point of view character a few times, but I ended up having her be a somewhat main character on the periphery and being seen through Sadie's eyes, who is the main character, because I felt like I could have Sadie grow and change as a character by watching what happens to Marguerite in the past and going through to the present. And, there's a lot of personal experience in this novel. My father had dementia, and I cared for him for a period of time until it got to the point to where his needs exceeded what I was able to provide in the way of care. And he lived with me. And so I saw what that kind of decline does. I saw what it does to the person who's affected by it. And I also saw what it does to the family. And that was a very personal aspect of the novel. And just being a caregiver in general, all of those things really came out, I feel like, in this novel more so because I cared for both of my parents. And I know you're a hospice worker, so you know what that's like to have the end of life care and how much it can teach us about ourselves. And I think that's the core message in the novel, is just how our lives, whenever we get toward the end of our lives, how our actions impact others.
Mm-hmm. What is a book that you read in 2024 that really stuck with you?
Oh gosh, there are a couple that really stuck with me. One of my favorite books that I read in 24 was Manzi Shah's A Good Indian Girl. And that one on the surface seems like it might be a little bit more of a light read, but it is a very wonderful study in culture, for one thing, the culture, Eastern culture meeting Western culture, because Manzi is a Gujarati. And she writes about the experiences of Indian women in the diaspora. And it was very revealing of what women experience from her point of view in that culture. And also childless women who are child-free by choice, which I think is something that you don't really see a lot in women's fiction, that portrayal, and having a character cope with others around her, putting that kind of pressure of motherhood onto her, the cultural expectations and whatnot. It really just made me think a lot about how, there's a lot of assumptions that are put on women of all cultures to bear children and be a loving spouse and whatnot, and how Manzi was able to show this character's development outside of that. And so it really stuck with me that way. Another novel that really stuck with me was The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. I listened to that one on Audible, and I thought that was a masterclass in multiple points of view. And also a really good study in class distinctions and how the wealthy upper class, and this is historical fiction too, that takes place in the 1960s, how the class differences between working class and the generationally wealthy manifest in the story is really interesting.
What is a book that is coming out in 2025 that you're looking forward to reading?
Oh, so many there too. It's hard to narrow it down. One of the books I'm really looking forward to reading is Gothic Town by Emily Carpenter. It just sounds so intriguing, and it's almost like sounds a bit like a meta exploration of what Gothic fiction is. And I'm very excited to read that one. Oh gosh. It's so hard to think of things on the spot, but there's just so many books coming out. The other March Sisters are coming out. That's by my friend Liz Parker and a couple of her other author friends. They got together and they wrote an alternate history of Louisa May Alcott's March Sisters. And it doesn't include Jo. Jo's away at the time the story takes place. So it's the other three sisters. So I'm very interested in reading that one too.
That sounds really interesting. I always love getting book recommendations and hearing what people have been reading, because it's such a vast, publishing. And I mean, there's so many books on the market. So, being able to narrow down where you want to spend your time is so precious,
It is, for sure.
In terms of your writing, what is something that you're really proud of that has evolved for you since your very first book to where you are now?
I think something I'm most proud of is my patience, because it does require a lot of patience to do this work. Patience with yourself and your creative process. It starts there, not giving up whenever things get hard, and then also giving yourself permission to take breaks. And I think that that is something that I've learned to listen to myself about. And I probably am going to take a break after my next 2 books release, just because I've been very busy. I've been very productive, putting out at least 1 book every year since I published. And I just want to really take some downtime to refill the well. So I think patience is very important. And that's something that I'm proud of, that I've cultivated, because it does take time in order to have everything fall into place. And especially for newer authors who are just starting to their process of writing and querying and trying to find that break. It can be very frustrating. It can be very frustrating when all you're hearing is no. And I really do think that a lot of the no's that authors hear are market related more so than their writing. I do think there are some things that we can control and some things that we can't control about our writing careers, and focusing on the things you can control, like your writing craft and how you approach research and how you approach all of the things that go into being an author that you have some level of control over is important. And that's something that I feel like I've mastered somewhat, in the way that I'm okay with letting some things go. There have been many times where my books have been considered for a film option, and I have not yet received a film option. I can't control that, and so I think, 6 or 7 years ago, before I was published, having that hopefulness and that level of expectation would have been more difficult for me if things didn't turn out the way that I hoped they would. But now I've gotten a thicker skin, and I think that's another thing that I'm proud of, is just having a thicker skin. If people don't like my books, I don't take it personally. That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. The evolution of you being not only comfortable in your process, but what you were talking about there at the end, writing what you want to write, and like, if people connect with it, amazing. If they don't, not taking it personally, because something could be a masterpiece and it may not connect with someone. It may not, resonate with someone. And that doesn't mean it's not a masterpiece.
Right. Right. It's all subjective. And you see this, like you'll see really hugely famous books that a lot of people love, and you'll find 1-star reviews for them. And it doesn't matter what you write or how passionately you write it or how sincerely you write it. Not everyone is going to like it. And you shouldn't be trying to please everyone. I think art, when you get to the point where you're brave enough to create art that some people might not like, I think that's a growth sign as well, because the market, of course, with traditional publishing anyway, kind of dictates what gets published. And there are a lot of factors at play there. But ultimately, writing what you love to write, I think it comes across. And I think that levels up your art in such a way that people take notice, and it gets people talking. And I think getting people talking is kind of the whole point of art. So.
Yeah. Something that you did to help promote The Devil and Miss Davenport was to create and actually cook recipes from that time period, which people can find on Instagram, clips about it, which I think was so neat, because cooking, is an art form itself. Passing down family recipes, there's something so special about preserving that heritage. And then, of course, making it yourself and just living in that time period. It's like time traveling when you do a recipe from back then. I'm just curious, what was one of your favorites that you ended up doing? And, are you still doing anything like that?
It's funny. I really enjoyed diving into those old cookbooks and finding recipes to try. I ended up making ambrosia for my family's Christmas dinner this past Christmas, and everybody liked it. So that was a request by my mother-in-law. She was like, "Can you make your ambrosia?" And so I'm like, "Oh, sure." And my husband loves that ambrosia. So there have been some recipes. I really actually love that Jello salad that I made, that complexion salad or whatever it was called, the molded gelatin dessert with the carrots. It was really good. And those recipes are really special. And like some of them, like the ambrosia, especially, my mom used to make that for holidays and such. So it was almost a nostalgic thing for my own family for me to make that. But also like the pineapple upside down cake, she used to make those a lot. But in making those, it was just kind of a fun way to get people's attention, to draw a little bit of attention to the book, and also kind of slyly poke fun at like the stereotypical 1950s housewife kind of thing. Even though The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, we see that Loretta's maybe not really happy in that role. We do see that like food is kind of a thing of comfort in the novel. She makes certain dishes for her children that they enjoy. And even though like food isn't the main subject in that novel, I just wanted to add a little bit of fun to the promotion.
I think that's really neat. And like you said, a fun thing to be able to delve into. And who doesn't love food, right?
Right. Food brings us together.
Indeed. Indeed. So you were talking about how, a movie treatment is something that, of course, many authors think about and dream about. And, I'm just curious, have you like casted in your mind, like fantasy casted who you'd want to be for various books? Or are you one of those people that, it doesn't, you don't have a specific person in mind?
Yeah, sometimes I do. Like whenever I was writing Devil and Mrs. Davenport, Dr. Hansen was Jude Law in The Holiday. That's who I was imagining whenever I was writing that character. And sometimes I do cast and sometimes I don't. There's just one of those things like it is fun to kind of fantasize about like the possibility of your book becoming a film. But I honestly think that if that ever happened and an option sold and it ended up going into production, I wouldn't want to be very involved in the whole process of casting and just the script and the adaptation, because I feel like that inhibits the art form just a little bit. And I'm kind of curious to see what a producer and a director would do with my books and a scriptwriter. Like I think that's part of the fascination of the process for me.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self-Care Institute are here to support you. The Self-Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link. Last time we talked a little bit about music and, how that plays a role in your creative process and just, who you are as a creative person. Your latest book, of course, about a painter. Did you delve into that visual arts world when getting into this manuscript?
It's something that a lot of people don't really know about me, but I do have a background in visual arts. Well, I was a photographer for 10 years before I went into publishing full time, but I did paint and I did draw, and I actually was offered a scholarship from the Chicago Institute of Art at one point in time. My instructors, my high school instructors, submitted my portfolio for review, and I was going to have an interview, but my dad would not allow me to go to Chicago to go to college. So I do have a background in the visual arts. It's not a very deep one, and it's not something that I've done seriously in adulthood, but there's always been an interest in art history. There's always been an interest in the artistic process for me and what an artist goes through in their life, around their life, that helps inspire them. So when I I was writing Marguerite, I kind of pulled from some of my own experiences, but also some of the experiences of women artists from the era and people like Mary Cassatt and others who were women had a harder time breaking into the arts during the era that Marguerite was working in. There was a lot of sexism and a lot of misogyny. And some of that came from where the art commissions were coming from. These high society women who wanted their portraits painted. A lot of them preferred to be painted by men. And it was really kind of a popularity contest more than an actual talent contest in many, many ways. And I think with art, with success in the arts, sometimes it's who you know. And that was a lot of what was happening during that period of time too.
You bring up such good points. And I mean, I like to think that the creative world has evolved to where it's not necessarily a popularity contest, but I think that sometimes, unfortunately, it does come into play, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that there are a lot of factors in the modern creative fields that, you know, there's a lot of privilege that comes into play. Of course, we see more white people represented in the arts. We see more people that are heteronormative represented in the arts. And I think that even though it's getting better slowly. And then we take 3 steps forward and we fall like 2 steps back. So there's a lot of that happens. And, you know, popularity is kind of a factor, especially you see like books that, you know, RIP TikTok, but books that take off on TikTok tend to be the best sellers. And that is definitely, there's a popularity factor there. So I do think popularity is definitely still a factor in the arts, and star quality, star power, all of that still comes into play, even in writing, even though with writing, most of us are kind of behind the scenes more than like actors and musicians, say, for instance. But there still is a little bit of a popularity factor going on, even in writing.
I'd love to touch on the role of social media and promotion because, you know, unless someone's in it and, you know, actively being published or pursuing publication in whatever factor works well for them, you know, readers and listeners may not always know that authors have to usually do all their own promotion. So they're, you know, just canvassing social media so much. Can you speak to some of the challenges about that and, you know, some of the, if there are, positives in that regard as well?
I think the positives are the connections that you form with other authors, with your readers, with the people that can have a little bit of a positive influence on your work and on your life, and then you can positively influence theirs. I think that's the positive with social media for sure. Some of the negatives are just the amount of time that it takes to do self-promotion. You know, we talked about those videos that I did for The Devil and Mrs. Davenport with the cooking. One of those videos took me 2 days to produce, and I'm talking 2 full days to produce. From the time of making the recipes, filming myself making the recipes, to the voiceovers and the editing and adding the music and adding the graphics, those were quite an endeavor. So I think a lot of times content creators, people will say things like, oh, that's not a real job, or that's easy. And it's not easy to create content. As you know, from being a podcast host, there are a lot of things behind the scenes that end creating the final product. And with photography too, I learned that. And it's not just the act of hosting the podcast or taking the picture or making the video. It's everything that goes behind the scenes. And with social media, it can consume your entire life. So I've really started limiting myself on like how long I'm on social media and how many things that I do. I figured out that Instagram for me is my best platform. So that's where I focus a lot of my energy on social media. But I also like really push on my newsletter. My newsletter is like the number one thing that I focus on. And that's something that I feel like authors need more than anything is a newsletter, because you're speaking directly to your readership with your newsletter. People that will click on a link and buy your books, people that will look at your calls to action and take action. Whereas with social media, it's a little bit variable on how well it works as a promotional tool. I think it can't hurt for sure, but does social media actually sell books? I think yes and no. I think social media works best when other people are talking about your books. I think that's when it sells the most books. And I definitely saw that with the recent attention that The Devil and Mrs. Davenport got on TikTok. My sales skyrocketed during that time, and I had absolutely nothing to do with it. So I think it really is more about just getting people more familiar with who you are, less than selling books when you do social media as an author.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I love that you talk about the positivity of making connections to the readers, because, I mean, I know for me, one of the things I loved, and this was the time before social media, was being able to, write my favorite author of the moment and be like, hey, I really loved your book, and actually getting a response back. I remember writing Margaret Atwood and getting a response back when I was in college. And I just thought that was the most wonderful feeling, is that connection. This person took the time out of their busy day to connect with me, a lowly reader. That's how I felt. And social media amplifies that, because you can almost have a direct conversation with readers. And it's also great for authors. You get that feedback, it's good validation, but you're also like, oh, okay, I'm making an impact, or this is being received the way I assumed it was received, or this is being received in a way I didn't know, but it's still making waves, however.
Yeah. And I've had the experience of readers reaching out to me via DM, especially on Instagram or through my contact form on my website. And nothing makes my day more than hearing from a reader. And it really is special. And I always respond. There's sometimes whenever a DM will end up in my request and I might not see it for a few days. So if that ever happens, it's not that I'm not responding to someone because I don't want to. It's just that I haven't seen it yet. But that is one of the aspects that I really love about being an author, is connecting with readers one-on-one like that.
Excellent. Well, we've got time for one more question. And I'm trying to think of something that I hadn't asked before, because I love learning more about you and more about your process. But are you interested in a more serious question or a more quirky, fun question?
That's hard. Let's do quirky fun.
Oh, I feel like this could really go in either category. And it's, what is something on your bucket list that you recently crossed off?
Oh gosh, something on my bucket list that I recently crossed off. That's a hard one. I think the biggest thing on my bucket list that I've crossed off is becoming a published author. And I remember writing that in an interview. I think Ashley Hasty asked me a bucket list question, and that's what I told her. It's that's the biggest thing that was on my bucket list, was becoming a published author. And that's happened. But yeah, I can't say that there's anything recent that really stands out to me that I've crossed off. I do want to make it Paris at some point in my 5th decade. That was supposed to be my 50th birthday gift to myself, was a trip to Paris, but didn't happen this year for various reasons. But that is something that I want to cross off fairly soon.
Excellent. Well, that sounds like a wonderful bucket list aspiration. And I'm glad that you were able to check off one of your largest bucket lists, which is to become an author, one of my personal favorites, not just because you're my friend, but, fantastic writer. Listeners, please check the show notes for links to pre-order, to purchase, to support Paulette. And as always, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Creative Piecemeal. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired. This podcast is independently created and produced by the host, Tami Takaishi. More details about today's guest can be found in the show notes, along with links to the podcast's socials, merch store, and ways to support arts organizations AHA Broadway and New Normal Rep, both near and dear to Tami's heart. Don't forget to visit creativepiecemeal.com, the official podcast website, where you can leave fan mail, write a review, explore Tami's blog, and discover the growing collection of episodes. Special thanks to our audio engineer, Alex Rapetti. Additional narration by Dante Jace. Let's keep celebrating creativity in all its forms.